We are already in week 10. This semester has really flown by, hasn't it? I've really enjoyed working with you. This week, we're going to continue our discussion of social identity theory, this time with a focus on stereotypes and intergroup conflict. Let's face it, people can be pretty nasty to each other. After this week's lecture, you'll have a better understanding of why this is the case. I wish we could all just get along, but that's wishful thinking. Over to you, Professor.
Thanks, Irving. It's interesting that you use the term wishful thinking to describe a world in which we treat each other better. It's true that human beings are capable of extreme evil. No one would doubt that. But let's not forget that we're also capable of extreme good, okay? Now, as Irving said, we've arrived at week 10, where we'll be deepening our understanding of social identity theory. The content for this week will be a little different from previous weeks, though. We'll have a first lecture, followed by an online forum activity, but we won't have a second lecture. Instead, I'll be giving a brief overview of an episode of Black Mirror, and I'll offer you the option of watching it. I'm making this optional for two reasons. First, not everyone will have access to this show on demand. It's currently on Netflix in Australia, so you'll have to either have a Netflix subscription or know someone else who has one and will let you watch it with them. The second reason it's optional to watch this episode is that the show is extremely violent, and I mean brutally violent. So if you're sensitive to violence, then it's best that you not watch the episode. But for those of you willing to watch, it is an extremely profound story, and it perfectly illustrates the dynamics of social identity theory, exaggeration and polarization, stereotyping, and social conflict that we've been talking about in this series of lectures. So the episode is called Men of Fire, and it was aired in Black Mirror's third season. The runtime is 1 hour, and you can decide for yourself whether or not you want to watch it. Okay, let's get started with the lecture, shall we? The key problem across human history is not that different categories of people exist, but rather that we tend to value people differently according to those categories. We generally privilege members of our own group and seek to place members of other groups at a disadvantage. This is it. This really explains the nature of social conflict. We're not just different from one another, but we perceive some groups to be superior, usually our own, and some groups to be inferior. We're going to look at this tendency in depth throughout this lecture. Get ready for an exploration of the dark side of human nature. Let's take a step back and look at the big picture first. Social relationships are characterized variously by integration and differentiation. Integration means that groups form on the basis of shared similarities. A group of people who share a common characteristic form a social group. Men, women, Americans, Australians, Black people, white people, homosexuals, heterosexuals, etc. Within each of these groups, there is a certain coherence and consistency. What's more, they define their coherence in relation to differences that they have vis-a-vis other groups. So Americans are Americans because they are not Australians. Homosexuals are homosexuals because they are not heterosexuals. Muslims are Muslims because they are not Christians. So people are always trying to fit themselves into groups and distinguish themselves from other groups. But the problem, again, isn't so much that groups are different, but rather that they have different access to resources. So this is the fundamental problem surrounding intergroup conflict in my view. Economic inequality between groups creates the haves and the have-nots. This inequality fuels competition and rivalry over limited resources. The result is that members of groups do not often see themselves as equals, but rather as superior to members of other groups. A key characteristic of social groups is that they tend to prioritize members of the in group and derogate and denigrate members of the out group. After all, why should some social groups have more and others less? We are all, of course, individuals, but what makes us different from animals is that we are also more than individuals. We are members of wider collectives. And when we interact with each other, we do so not so much as individuals, but rather as representatives of a wider social group. A key problem for the social psychologist is that the line between inter-individual interaction and intergroup interaction is hard to pin down. At what point do we stop being defined by our relationship to others? I don't think anyone can really answer this question because we are a fundamentally social species. We're really just a reflection of the groups to which we belong. Now let's define a group as a body of people who feel that they are a group. This definition has three distinct components. First, there's a cognitive element. A group cannot be said to exist unless the members of the group know that it exists. This may seem self-evident, but consider this example. Are left-handed, red-headed Russians born in November of 1979 to a single-parent household a group? Well, probably not, because they don't recognize themselves as such. Second, there is an evaluative element. You can be a member of a dominant group, like white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or a member of a disadvantaged group, like African migrants. Third, there is an emotional element. You may have positive feelings towards members of the in-group and negative feelings towards members of the out-group. It's also worth noting that groups can be based on objective criteria, something like skin color, or subjective criteria, for example, religious identity. It's worth noting that both individuals and groups do not have stable identities. They change over space and time. It might be helpful to think of all social relationships existing somewhere on a continuum. On the one hand, we have purely interpersonal relationships, and on the other, purely intergroup relationships. Now, in practice, purely interpersonal relationships are absurd and impossible. Why? Because all individuals, when interacting with each other, bring their group memberships with them, often just by virtue of their appearance. Purely intergroup relations are hypothetically possible, but quite rare. An example of this might be a war between two nations. Generally speaking, relationships sit somewhere on that continuum. Individuals can cooperate or compete, so can groups, and so can individuals as members of groups. A crucial point made by social psychologists is that it is difficult to depersonalize and dehumanize another individual, but it is far easier to depersonalize and dehumanize an individual as a member of another group. Let's take a look at a classic social psychology experiment that illustrates the nature of social relationships in a competitive environment.
Back in the 50s, a social psychologist named Muzafer Sherif asked the question, what is it exactly about groups that makes for such tension between them? And what can be done to reduce that tension? Well, Sharif and his colleagues decided to take this question outside of the lab and into the real world. Well, not really the real world, it was kind of an artificial situation, but they were able to create this artificial situation using pre-adolescent boys. What they did was they put on kind of a fake summer camp. They had two different groups of boys, of about 20 boys each. And the first week of this camp, they separated the boys, and the boys didn't know of the existence of the other group. So there were two different camps going on. What they did was they focused on group bonding at this time. As expected, about a week of activities brought these individuals close together as a group, as a team. In the second stage, what the researchers did was they introduced the groups to each other. And they created competition for resources where there could only be one winner and there has to be one loser. There were no prizes for second place, no consolation prizes. As expected, this kind of competition created a lot of tension between the two groups. At first it was just some verbal name-calling between the groups. And then it proceeded to vandalism and theft and even physical violence, to the point where the researchers had to physically separate the boys. Now comes stage 3. At this stage, the researchers created fake situations where the two groups had to work together in order to solve the problem. In one example, they pretended that the water for the camp was shut off in such a way that vandals must have done it. So all the boys had to work together to figure out this problem and resolve the problem. There were many such similar team-building activities between both groups. And at the end of the third stage, what they found was that the boys liked each other much more because of these team-building activities. At first, there was very strong in-group bias, where the team members just associated with other team members. But after these team-building events, where the groups actually got together to solve a common problem, they found out that they really liked each other a lot more than before. This whole experiment was a confirmation of Sharif's realistic conflict theory, which states that when there's competition for resources, negative feelings will arise. Now, over 50 years have passed since his first experiment. And what modern theories tell us is that A, this theory is correct, and B, one of the best ways to reduce this kind of outgroup bias and this prejudice and discrimination we have for other groups is to socialize with the other groups, is to work towards a common cause.
After 3 weeks of learning about social identity theory, we finally arrive at some key definitions, and these are important. Social identity can be defined as the part of an individual's self-concept derived from group memberships. The individual is essentially a crystallization of these multiple social groups into one person. Social categorization can be defined as the process of creating us and them or in-group and out-group distinctions. Generally speaking, individuals want to belong to a social group provided that it makes a positive contribution to their self-concept. Once a group fails to make a positive contribution, the individual may try to leave the group, often for a higher status one, but this upward movement across groups isn't always possible. When an individual cannot leave the group, then he or she has two choices: either reinterpret the group or work to change the group. Reinterpretation means trying to think more positively about the group. We're not so bad, or we have a rich history and heritage, and if we work hard, we can get ahead. Changing the group means working to improve its reputation or status in the wider society. So here's an interesting set of experiments. Well, at least I find them interesting. I think you will too. Let's start with the research question. What are the minimal conditions under which an individual will come to perceive an in-group and an out-group? We already know, for example, that differences along ethnic and religious lines can lead to significant prejudice, discrimination, and social conflict. All right, this is already firmly established. But what about more ambiguous groups? Can we still recreate that us against them mentality? Well, social psychologists have answered these questions. In these experiments, bear in mind that there was no face-to-face interaction and there was no previous hostility or conflict amongst the participants. Okay? So the participants were first asked to do some trivial tasks. This might mean guessing how many dots are in a cluster or expressing a preference for abstract paintings. After providing this information, each participant was told which group they belonged to. For example, Group 1 consisted of people who overestimated the number of dots, and Group 2 consisted of people who underestimated the group of dots. So these are really artificial groups that aren't that meaningful in the broader scheme of things. And yet, the fact that they perceived themselves as belonging to a group still had a profound effect on their behavior. This is where it gets really interesting. Each person was asked to allocate money to other members of either the in-group or the out-group, those who overestimated or underestimated or preferred abstract painting 1 or abstract painting 2 or whatever. Guess what they found? Well, that's right. Significantly more money was allocated to the in-group than to members of the out-group. In other words, if you underestimated the number of dots in a cluster, you allocate more money to others who similarly underestimated the number of dots, and vice versa. These experiments show just how powerful group membership can be. The real irony here is that the participants were never actually together as a group, but they still assigned superior values to themselves and inferior values to the outgroup anyway. It's fascinating, isn't it? You can imagine that if we give preferential treatment to members of the in-group based on abstract paintings or counting dots, then imagine the level of preferential treatment or discrimination, for that matter, in more firmly established groups like race, gender, and ethnicity. Okay, I'm now going to pass it over to Irving so that he can give you your Week 10 exercise for the online forum. And after that, remember that there's no second lecture for this week. Instead, I've invited you to watch an episode of Black Mirror called Men Against Fire. This can be found in Season 3 of Netflix. Unfortunately, I can't reproduce this episode for you for copyright reasons, but you can still watch it on your own. But remember, this episode is extremely violent, so you're not obligated to watch it. My own view is that the story is very disturbing, but highly relevant to social identity theory and to understanding the processes of exaggeration, polarization, and dehumanization. Okay, over to you, Irving.